In the autumn of 1887, on the high plains of western Kansas, where the wind came unbroken from Colorado and the grass had long since given up arguing with it, a young woman raised her hand at a county auction and bought a broken windmill for $6. The auctioneer paused. He looked at her the way men in that county looked at women who did not behave as expected, which was a look compounded of amusement and mild irritation in roughly equal parts. The windmill stood on a quarter section of alkaline scrubland 3 miles south of the town of Hadley, and it had not turned in 11 years. Its tower legs were rust red, and one of them had buckled at the knee, listing the whole structure 10 degrees to the east as though it were trying to bow to the ground. 2 of its 8 fan blades were missing entirely. A third hung by a single bolt. The well it had once served was dry. The homestead cabin had collapsed in the blizzard of 1882, and what remained was a scatter of gray boards, half swallowed by blue stem grass. $6, the auctioneer said again, as though he expected someone to laugh. No one did. No one bid against her. There was nothing there to bid on. Her name was Maren Schulte. She was 28 years old. She had arrived in Hadley 6 weeks earlier with a leather valise, a set of well-used steel drafting instruments wrapped in oilcloth, and $31 she had carried from Abilene after the surveying firm where she had worked as a copyist and field recorder for 4 years dismissed her following the death of her employer, a man named Otto Voss, who had taught her more about reading land than most licensed surveyors ever learn. Otto had been her mother's cousin. He had recognized in her a quality he described, in his flat Rhineland way, as the willingness to look at what is actually there rather than what you expect to see. He had taught her to use a transit, to pace a baseline, to read a soil core, and to draw a legal plat with a steadiness of hand that made the lines true. He had also taught her, in the last 2 years before the scarlet fever took him, to read water. She had come to him at 22, after her father died and the farm in Missouri passed to her older brother by the simple arithmetic of inheritance that no one thought to question. She had arrived in Abilene with a carpet bag and a letter of introduction from her mother and a willingness to learn whatever work was available. Otto had looked at her across his cluttered office table, taken in the set of her jaw and the directness with which she met his eyes, and said he supposed she could copy a plat to begin with. Within a month, she was in the field. Within 6 months, she could run a baseline survey without supervision. He was not a warm man, in the demonstrative sense. What he gave her instead of warmth was time and attention, and the assumption that she could understand what he showed her, which was the more valuable gift. Water reading was not a science that Kansas courts recognized. It was an accumulation of knowledge gathered over decades of drilling across the short grass plains, a knowledge of buried formations, of the angle at which old creek beds had shifted, of the particular color and density of alkali deposits and what they told a careful observer about what lay beneath. Otto had written none of it down. He carried it in his hands and his eyes and his conversations with Maren across 100 miles of claim surveys. And when he died, he left her the oilcloth kit and a ledger of field observations spanning 12 years. She had read that ledger cover to cover 3 times on the train from Abilene. She had read it the way someone reads a letter from a person who is gone, carefully and more than once, trying to understand not only the words, but the intelligence behind them. The ledger was not organized the way a proper field journal would be organized. It did not proceed by date or county or client name. It proceeded by what had interested Otto, which was water and the formations that held it, and the formations that deceived the eye about where water would or would not be found. He had developed, across those 12 years, a conviction that the short grass plains were underlain by a second water system that most drillers never reached because they stopped at the first failure. and the ledger was, in part, a record of the places where he believed that second system could be found if someone had the patience to go through the clay that separated them. He hadn't had the resources, in most cases, to pursue the thought further than a notation and a star. He had trusted that someone would, eventually. The quarter section south of Hadley appeared in it twice. Otto had surveyed the original homestead claim in 1875, and he had noted something in his tight, looping German script that Marin had translated slowly, reading it with a lamp close to the page. He had noted that the alkali surface crust was thin and localized, no more than 30 feet in diameter around the well casing, and that the surrounding soil profile suggested a perched water table, interrupted by a lens of impermeable clay at about 40 feet, with the likelihood of a second, deeper formation below. He had noted the windmill as already inadequate for the depth needed. He had noted in the margin a single phrase she had returned to many times: "The surface deceives here." She bought the broken windmill because of those 4 words. If you have ever driven across the high plains in the dry months, you understand what it is to look at a landscape that appears to offer nothing. The sky is enormous, and the land beneath it is small. And the small things on the land, the windmills and the sheds and the claim stakes, seem like arguments no one is going to win. Megerin Schulte understood this feeling and did not share it. She had spent 4 years learning to read the land rather than to surrender to its appearance, and what she saw on that quarter section, past the listing tower and the collapsed cabin and the dry well casing, was a specific set of soil colors and a particular lay of the ground that matched what Otto had described and pointed towards something the county assessor had never thought to look for. She paid her $6, took her receipt, folded it into the oilcloth kit alongside the drafting instruments, and walked back to the rooming house on Hadley's main street where she was paying 40 cents a night. There was a woman in that rooming house named Greta Albrecht, who was 63 years old and had lived in Hadley since 1869, and who managed the rooms and the kitchen with the efficiency of someone who had long since stopped expecting the world to arrange itself conveniently. Greta had watched Marin at the auction from across the street, and when Marin came back through the door, Greta set a cup of coffee in front of her without being asked, and waited. Marin told her about the ledger and about Otto's notation. She showed Greta the German text and the translation she had written in pencil beside it. Greta was quiet for a time. Then she said, "Herschel Vane put that windmill in. He drilled that well himself in 1876. It came up dry at 38 feet, and he called it finished. He stopped at the clay," Marin said. Greta looked at her. "Stopped at the clay," she repeated slowly. "There is a formation below it. Otto was certain. He wrote that the clay lens was not more than 12 feet thick. A proper well casing below 48 feet would reach the second aquifer." Greta turned her coffee cup in her hands. 48 feet is a deep well. 52 to be safe, Marin said. "I intend to find out." What she did not tell Greta that evening was the rest of what she had worked out from the ledger. Otto's 1875 survey had been a routine homestead plat, the kind filed in duplicate at the county land office, and in duplicate again at the territorial capital. But in the ledger there was a third entry, undated, written in the smaller hand Otto used for private notation. It described a conversation he had overheard at the Hadley land office in the spring of 1878 between the county recorder and a man whose name Otto had written only as Pell. The conversation concerned a pending application for a railroad right-of-way that would run through the southern tier of the county, and the man, Pell, had said with some confidence that the survey routed the line across the alkaline scrubland south of town because the assessments showed it was worth nothing and the owners would settle cheap. Otto had drawn a small star beside this note. He had written nothing else. He had been at the land office that day as a credentialed surveyor and would not have thought it appropriate to report a conversation overheard between county officials. He would have noted it as he noted everything that seemed inconsistent with what the ground actually told him, and he would have moved on. What he could not have anticipated was that the ledger would outlast him by 9 years and come into the hands of someone who had been in his company long enough to understand what a star in the margin meant. She understood it to mean that he believed this was not right, that he could not prove it, and that he was setting it down so that someone who could prove it would know where to look. Marin had spent a week in the Hadley land office working methodically through the record books on the public shelf, while the county recorder watched her from behind his desk with an expression of tolerant boredom. She had found the 1878 right-of-way application. She had found the assessment records that accompanied it. She had found the name of the assessor who had certified the quarter section south of town as alkaline waste of minimal value, a man named Theodore Pell, who also appeared in the county records as having purchased 5 adjacent parcels in the southern tier within the following 6 months at prices well below the township average. Theodore Pell was not a figure who appeared often in Hadley's daily life. He had moved to Wichita in 1882 and conducted his remaining Kansas business through a land agent named Shreve, who maintained a small office 2 doors down from the rooming house. Marin had walked past that office every morning for 6 weeks and noted the hours posted in the window and the light that came on at 7 and went off at 5, regular as a clock. She was not ready to think about Theodore Pell yet. There was work to be done first, and the work had to come before anything else. She had spent a week in the Hadley land office before the auction, working methodically through the record books on the public shelf, and she had spent 3 more days there after she bought the quarter section, reading backwards through the assessment records for the southern tier parcels. The county recorder was a young man named Devlin, who had taken the position the prior year and who did not have the institutional habits of his predecessor. He watched her with mild puzzlement but without obstruction, which was more than she had expected. She was careful not to ask for anything she was not entitled to see, and she was careful to take notes rather than to linger, and she was careful to behave as though she were doing something routine, which she believed she was. The routine was this: she identified the assessments for the 4 southern tier parcels that had changed hands in 1878 and 1879 following the right-of-way announcement. She compared the assessed values against the township average for parcels of comparable size filed in the same period, using the public assessment ledger that Devlin kept on an open shelf near the door. The suppression was not subtle, once you were looking for it. The 4 parcels were assessed at between 30% and 40% of the township average, each described in identical language as alkaline waste of minimal agricultural potential, language that appeared in no other assessments from that period, where assessors typically wrote in their own voices and gave specific soil observations. These 4 were identical. They had been written by the same hand. She found the name in the assessor's certification block on each of the 4 records: Theodore Pell, County Assessor, Auxiliary. She had not known there was an auxiliary position. She looked for the original appointment record and found it tucked in the back of the 1877 volume, a single half-page signed by the then county commissioner and countersigned by the then recorder, appointing Pell to a temporary assessment role for the right-of-way corridor parcels specifically. It was a narrow appointment, and it had expired after 90 days, which was exactly 90 days after the 4 assessments were filed. She copied the appointment record and the 4 assessment pages in her precise hand and folded them into the oilcloth kit alongside the ledger. Then she went back to the rooming house and sat with Greta and told her what she had found, all of it, including the part about Pell's subsequent land purchases. Greta listened without interrupting. When Marin finished, Greta was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "I remember when those families left. What were they like?" The Brants had been here since '72. Elsa Brant planted the first kitchen garden on that side of the county. The Fisks were young, newly married. They didn't want to go. Greta smoothed her apron with both hands, in the way she did when something settled heavily in her. They thought the land was failing. They all thought the land was failing. The land was not failing, Marin said. No, Greta said. I suppose it was not. She hired a well driller named Abel Fouts, who operated out of a machinery shed at the eastern edge of town, and who had the distinction of being the only man in Hadley County willing to drill past 40 feet on a dry hole. Abel was 51, built like a fence post, and deeply skeptical of women who carried drafting instruments. He quoted her a price that was fair and told her the job would take 8 days if the ground cooperated, and 12 if it did not. She told him where to set the rig. She told him the target depth and the formation he would pass through at 40 feet. He looked at her for a long moment and then went back to greasing his auger. The drilling began on a Monday in late October, with the temperature at 38 degrees and a northwest wind that flattened the blue stem and made the rusted windmill tower creak in long, slow cycles. Abel Fouts' rig was a steam-powered cable tool, a thing of considerable weight and moderate reliability that he had purchased from a retiring driller in Dodge City 3 years before. It arrived on a flatbed wagon drawn by 2 draft horses, and the setting of the rig above the old well casing took the better part of the first day. His crew was 2 men, brothers-in-law who worked without much conversation, and who did not appear to have any opinion about Marin's presence at the site. She was there every morning before Abel's crew arrived. She kept her ledger open and noted the color and texture of every soil core that came up, comparing it against Otto's observations from 12 years before. The soil ran as Otto had described it, reddish loam to gray-brown clay loam, to a grittier layer that might have been a very old creek bed deposit, and then at 30 feet a stratum of calcareous material, white and powdery, that she had seen in other drill cores in the county and that often preceded the hard gray clay of a perched aquifer seal. She noted all of this in the field book and said nothing to Abel about it. He was a professional, and he did not need her commentary. What he needed was for her not to stop him. The gray clay appeared at 39 feet on the 4th day, exactly where Otto had said it would be. Abel stopped the rig and looked at her. "This is where Vane quit," he said. "Go through it," she said. He did not look pleased. Drilling through a clay seal was not difficult, but it took time and it cost money, and it was the kind of instruction that drillers did not always take well from a client who was not himself a driller. Abel Fouts, however, had spent enough years in western Kansas to have become curious about what lay below things, and he went through the clay. It was 11 feet thick. On the 5th day, at 50 feet, the drill met a fine, clean sand, and Abel pulled the last core and held it in his hand and looked at it for a long time, without speaking. Marin looked at it too. The sand was moist. It was the same color as the core Otto had sketched in the margin of his field observation, a pale buff with a slight glitter to it, which was quartz, which meant it was a well-sorted formation, the kind that holds water cleanly and gives it up willingly. Abel had the pump casing run and sealed by the end of the 6th day, and on the morning of the 7th day, water rose in the casing to within 18 feet of the surface. Clean water with a taste that had no alkali in it. Abel Fouts stood at the casing with a tin cup and drank it and said nothing for a long while. "Good water," he said at last. "Yes," Marin said. She paid him from the remainder of her $31 plus $6 she had earned, keeping accounts for a Hadley dry goods merchant during the weeks she'd been waiting. and she was left with $4 and some cents. The windmill could not be rebuilt from what was there. The tower was too far gone. The mechanism seized and corroded past salvage. She needed new ironwork, which she could not yet afford. What she had, for the moment, was a producing well on a quarter section she owned outright, and a knowledge that was not yet useful to anyone but her. The knowledge was a simple one. The surface had deceived everyone who had looked at this land, exactly as Otto had written. The well Herschel Vane had drilled in 1876 had stopped 11 feet short of water. 11 feet. The failure had not been the land's. It had been the measurement of the man who quit. She walked back to town and sat in the kitchen with Greta Albrecht and showed her the soil core she had kept from the 5th day, the clean sand that meant the aquifer, and Greta held it in her palm and said quietly, "What does this mean for the land?" "It means the assessment was wrong," Marin said. "The land is not alkaline waste. It has clean water at 50 feet, which means it can support crops, which means it has agricultural value. The 1878 assessment did not reflect." Greta set the core down carefully on the table. "You think the assessment was deliberately wrong?" "I think Otto thought so," Marin said. "He wrote a star beside a conversation he overheard. That is not a man who writes stars often." She went back to the land office the next morning with a specific request. She asked to see the original survey field notes from the 1878 right-of-way application. Not the plat, which was a public document, but the field notes, which were a supporting record and which the county was required to retain. The recorder, a young man named Devlin who had taken the position the prior year and who did not have the institutional habits of his predecessor, took 20 minutes to find them and handed them over without apparent concern. Marin sat at the reading table and went through them slowly. They were in a hand she did not recognize, not Otto's, not the clean official script of a trained surveyor. They were hasty, with inconsistent measurement notations in 2 pages where the bearing angles did not close properly, meaning the survey as recorded did not mathematically describe a closed polygon. She recognized this because Otto had taught her to check closure on every plat she drafted, and she had developed the habit of running the arithmetic in her head as she read. She made notes in pencil on a separate sheet. She asked Devlin if she might copy several pages. He said she might, and she spent 2 hours at the table producing clean copies of the field notes in her own precise hand, annotating the closure errors with calculations in the margins. Then she walked to the office of the Hadley County Gazette, which occupied a narrow building next to the hardware merchant, and she asked to speak with the editor, a man named Cass Tremaine, who had been printing the paper since 1871, and who, Greta had told her, was not fond of Theodore Pell, and had not been since a dispute over a printing contract in 1879. She had thought carefully about whether to go to Tremaine or to the county attorney first. She had decided on Tremaine because a newspaper editor was not empowered to subpoena records or compel testimony, which meant he could not make the situation worse if the evidence turned out to be insufficient. And because he had been in Hadley long enough to know the history of the land office in a way the county attorney, who had only been in his position 3 years, could not. She needed someone who knew the landscape of this particular wrong before she asked anyone with legal authority to walk into it. She laid the copies on Tremaine's desk. She laid Otto's ledger open to the private notation beside them. She explained what she had found in the field notes, the closure errors, the dates, the subsequent land purchases, the name that appeared in both places. She showed him the annotated closure calculations she had run twice the night before to make sure they were right. Tremaine read in silence for a long time. He was a thin, careful man with ink-stained fingers who read everything twice before he spoke. "You understand," he said at last, "that Theodore Pell will deny this through his agent and then through a lawyer, and that the land office records in Wichita may or may not have survived the fire of 1884. I know about the fire, Marin said, but the county records are a second original, and the field notes are here. Tremaine looked at the closure calculations she had annotated. You did this arithmetic. Yes. You were trained as a surveyor. I was trained by a licensed surveyor. My name appears as recorder on 47 plats filed in this county between 1883 and 1887. He was quiet for a moment. He picked up the annotated copy of the field notes and read it again, slowly. Then he said, "The man who drew these field notes, was he licensed?" "He appears in the Territorial Contractor Registry as a field surveyor for 1876 through 1879, Marin said. He would have known what a closure error meant. These are not the errors of someone who did not know his arithmetic. Tremaine set the page down. He put his hand flat on the copies. "I will need a week," he said. "I want to send a letter to the Territorial Surveyor's Office and ask whether they have a record of the original right-of-way application. If the field notes on file here differ from what was submitted there, that is not an error. That is a substitution." Marin had not considered this possibility directly, though it followed naturally from everything else. She looked at him. "Pell's land agent would have had access to the county files," Tremaine said quietly. "Shreve has been in that office since 1880. She walked home in the gray afternoon with the wind at her back and understood that what she had found was larger than she had thought, and that it was not finished. The week Tremaine had asked for became 10 days. During that time, Marin returned to the quarter section twice, measuring the ground with her transit and pacing the boundaries against the recorded plat. Noting that the southwest corner stake had been moved, she was almost certain sometime in the past several years. The stake was iron, set in a concrete collar, and the collar showed fresh Portland cement on its south face, a small gray crescent of new material against the weathered original. She photographed the collar with a notation in her field book and moved on. On the 11th day, Tremaine came to the rooming house and sat across the table from Marin and Greta Albrecht and placed a letter on the table. It was from the Territorial Surveyor's Office in Topeka, and it confirmed that the original 1878 right-of-way application, submitted to the Territorial Office, had been accompanied by field notes that did not match the field notes on file in Hadley County. The territorial copy showed closure errors on 2 of the same pages Marin had identified, which meant the territorial record and the county record agreed in their errors, and the copy she had found was the falsified version, the one prepared to support the assessments, not the original survey from which the assessment should have been derived. She held the letter and read it twice and set it down without speaking. Tremaine said, "The man who drew those field notes worked for Pell's Land Company in 1877 and 1878. His name is in the Territorial Office's Contractor Registry. He no longer practices." "Is Shreve named in anything?" Marin asked. "Not yet. Pell is named obliquely by the contractor's affiliation. Whether Shreve knew what he was holding in that office when the substitution was made, that is a different question." Tremaine gathered his papers. "I'm going to print what can be demonstrated. The field notes do not close. The county file does not match the territorial file. The subsequent land purchases are a matter of public record. The rest is for the county attorney." He printed it on a Thursday. The paper carried 2 columns on the front page, factual and spare, citing the field note discrepancies, the closure calculations, and the record of Theodore Pell's land acquisitions in the months following the right-of-way approval. It named the water Marin had found at 50 feet. It named her as the person who had found it. The county attorney, a man named Holt, who had been in his position for 3 years and who read the Gazette on Thursday mornings, called at the land office that same afternoon and asked Devlin to secure the original field note file under lock. He sent a letter by the evening stage to Pell's known address in Wichita. He sent a separate letter to the land agent Shreve, who was not in his office that day or the next. Shreve left Hadley on the Friday stage. No one stopped him because there was nothing yet sufficient to stop him with. He did not return. His office stayed locked through November and into December, and the hours card remained in the window as though he might come back at any moment, which he did not. Theodore Pell did not come to Hadley. He corresponded through a Wichita attorney in terms that denied everything the Gazette had printed and suggested that the closure errors in the field notes were clerical, a commonplace in surveys of that era, and that his land purchases had been at market rate for assessed value, which was precisely and demonstrably true, which was also the problem. The county attorney built his case across the winter. Maurin provided her annotated copies, her field measurements, and her testimony regarding the relocated corner stake, which a county surveyor re-examined in December and confirmed had been disturbed within the preceding 5 years. The surveyor noted that the disturbance was consistent with the stake having been pulled and redriven approximately 2 feet to the south, which would have shifted the property boundary in a way that reduced the assessed acreage of the parcel by a small but meaningful fraction. He put this in writing in a report filed with the county attorney's office on the 14th of December. Greta Albrecht provided a sworn statement regarding a conversation she had witnessed in 1878 between the previous county recorder and a man she identified as Pell's contractor, a conversation in which the contractor had referred to survey work as already arranged, 3 days before the right-of-way application was formally filed. Greta had not thought this worth mentioning before. She had not known what it meant. She knew now. She told Maurin about giving the statement on a Sunday afternoon in the kitchen, sitting with her hands around a coffee cup, in the careful way she had of describing things that mattered to her without ornamentation. She said she had remembered the conversation for 9 years, without understanding why it had stayed with her. She said the contractor had laughed when he said, "already arranged," as though the arrangement were particularly pleasing to him, and that this was what had fixed the moment in her memory. That particular laugh, which had not matched the ordinary business talk around it. She had not had a context for it then. She had one now. It was a slow process, the kind that lives in letters and depositions and county ledger comparisons, rather than in rooms where people shout at one another. Maurin found this suited her. She had learned patience from Otto, who had said once, setting his transit over a benchmark on a windy ridge, that the land does not lie, only the people who describe it do, and that the land will outlast their descriptions. She believed this in a way that was not philosophical but practical. The same way she believed that water at 50 feet was true water, regardless of what a falsified assessment said, lay above it. The winter was cold and long in the way Kansas winters tended to be, arriving early and staying past welcome. She kept busy. She contracted with a man named Harker to farm the quarter section on shares in the spring, with the provision that Harker would sink a second well casing, adjacent to the first, to increase the water draw before planting. She drafted the agreement herself, in the precise legal language she had learned from 4 years of watching Otto draft easements and right-of-way agreements. And she had Devlin at the land office witness it. Harker, who was a practical and unglamorous man, who cared primarily about whether the water was real, drilled a test bucket and tasted it and signed without much ceremony. By February of 1888, the county attorney had identified 4 parcels, not just the one Maurin had purchased, where the right-of-way assessment appeared to have been deliberately suppressed to facilitate a below-market acquisition by Pell's Land Company. 3 of those parcels had been sold by their original claimants at the assessed price in the months following the right-of-way announcement. Claimants who had believed the assessment and taken what they could get. Families who had left Kansas with money that was less than half what the land was worth. The fourth parcel was the one Marin now owned. Its original claimant, a homesteader named Rude Wahlberg, had not sold when the others did. He had held out for 2 years, believing the assessment was wrong, unable to prove it, and had eventually forfeited the claim for non-payment of county taxes in 1880. The county had acquired it at tax sale and held it until 1881, when it was sold for back taxes plus a nominal premium to a land company in Wichita. That land company had sold it again in 1883, and again in 1885, and again in 1886, each transaction a small loss as the buyer recognized the alkaline surface in the dry well and moved on, until it had arrived at the county auction in October 1887 as an unsold remainder assessed at $6, which was precisely what Marin had paid for it. She had not known about Wahlberg when she bought the land. She found his name in the tax forfeiture records in January, searching backward from the chain of title. He had filed the original homestead claim in 1874. He had built the cabin and the well and the windmill. He had farmed the land for 6 years, including the 2 years after the false assessment, trying to make it work without the water that was there and that no one had been willing to drill for. He had paid his taxes for 5 of those 6 years. He had written 2 letters to the county assessor's office disputing the valuation, both of which were recorded as received, and neither of which had received a written response. The 6th year he had been unable to pay, and the land had been taken. She did not know where Wahlberg had gone. The county records did not say. Marin knew something more about the other families by then. Greta had told her what she remembered. One had been a widow named Elsa Brandt, who had sold her quarter section for $40 and moved to her daughter's household in Missouri. One had been a young couple named Corey and Ada Fisk, who had taken $65 and gone to Oklahoma, and Greta believed they had eventually prospered there, which was something. One had been a German immigrant named Sievert, who had accepted $52 and disappeared from the county records entirely. She thought about these people during the long evenings in the rooming house, the lamp casting yellow light on Otto's ledger and on the plat she had drawn of the southern tier parcels, each one labeled with its assessed value and its actual value as she had come to understand it. The difference was not small. It was, across the 4 parcels, something in the range of $800 in suppressed value at the time of the transactions, and the railroad land it had facilitated had sold and resold since 1879, compounding the original harm into something the county attorney described carefully as significant. He meant that the land Pell had acquired below value and sold to the railroad at market rate had returned several $1,000s on the original investment of suppressed purchase prices. The precise figure was difficult to establish because the resale chain was complicated, but the county attorney was not trying to establish a precise figure. He was trying to establish that a wrong had been done, which was a different and more achievable task. She was not going to become wealthy from what was under the windmill. The well gave her water and made the land worth farming, and she intended to farm it, or to find someone who would farm it on shares while she continued the work that needed doing. What the land gave her was a foundation, the first she had had since Otto died, and she had not expected to find it by raising her hand at an auction over a thing no one else wanted. She thought about this sometimes, that the $6 had bought her not just a parcel and a well, but a reason to be in this county. A reason to be in this particular land office on this particular morning in November, when the right records were on the shelf and she had the training to read them. She did not think it was luck. She thought it was the accumulated weight of everything Otto had taught her, deposited in the right place at the right time by the long, patient logic of inherited knowledge. In March, the county attorney reached an agreement with Pell's Wichita counsel. Pell did not admit the survey had been falsified. He agreed through counsel to a cash settlement paid to the county land fund, which the county attorney designated for distribution to the families who had sold their parcels at suppressed prices. It was not the full amount the land had been worth, because proving the precise suppression required testimony that could not easily be compelled across state lines. It was enough to make a difference. Elsa Brandt received a bank draft in Missouri. The Fisks received theirs in Oklahoma. The German immigrant Sievert could not be found, and his share sat in the county fund for 7 years before it was applied to a school construction bond, which was not justice exactly, but was not nothing. Cass Tremaine printed a brief account of the settlement in the Gazette. He did not name Marin specifically because she had asked him not to, but he noted that the survey discrepancy had been identified by a trained land recorder working from field notes in her predecessor's private ledger, and that the discovery had begun with a well-drilled on-ground everyone in the county had dismissed as worthless. Greta Albrecht cut out the column and kept it in the kitchen drawer. Marin ordered a new windmill from a manufacturer in Salina in the spring of 1888. She could not yet afford the best, so she bought a smaller unit, 8-foot diameter, adequate for a domestic well and a kitchen garden and the livestock water that Harker would need when he began planting in May. She paid Abel Foots $2 to help her set the new tower in the footprint of the old one, which meant first dismantling what remained of the original. The original tower came down on a cold April morning. Abel removed the surviving fan blades first, setting them on the ground with a care that surprised her, as though he felt some obligation to the machine that had stood here for 11 years, unable to do the work it was built for. The tower legs came out of their anchor blocks with considerable difficulty, the iron having fused with the concrete in the years of moisture and rust, and Abel used a long pry bar and language she could not hear clearly over the wind. The mechanism at the top was past salvage, as she had known it would be, a mass of corroded gears and a cracked pump shaft, and Abel set it aside without sentiment. She kept one of the original fan blades. It was the one that had hung by a single bolt, still intact, rust-colored and pitted, its surface rough as old bark. She didn't know exactly why she kept it. It seemed to her a record of the years of effort in a place where the resources to succeed had been 11 feet below reach, and she thought it deserved to remain somewhere near the site of its failure, which was not a failure of the machine, but of the decision to stop too soon. Abel dug out the rusted anchor bases and drove new posts while Marin assembled the lower platform sections with a wrench she had taken from Otto's kit, a heavy one with a cracked wooden handle that he had used to true up transit mounts. She had carried it from Abilene in the valise, not knowing what she would need it for, only knowing it was his, and that his judgment about what tools mattered had been reliably right. The wrench was heavier than what the task required, but she had grown accustomed to working with it, and it seated bolt heads with a satisfying solidity that the lighter tools in Abel's kit did not match. The new tower went up in 2 days. The head and vane went on the 3rd day, and on the afternoon of the 3rd day, the wind came from the northwest, which it always did, and the fan turned for the first time, with the particular low whistle of a new mechanism not yet worn smooth, and the pump rod cycled, and water rose clean and cold in the casing, and ran into a galvanized tank Abel had set at the base. Abel filled a bucket and held it up to the April light and looked at the clarity of it. "Same water," he said. "Same water," Marin said. She stood with her back to the new structure and looked south across the quarter section at the blue-stem grass bending in long silver waves, the same grass that had grown over the collapsed cabin and the failed well and the rusted tower for 11 years, indifferent to the whole history of what had been attempted and abandoned here. The grass did not know about Rudd Wohlberg's letters to the assessor's office. It did not know about the 4 words in Otto's margin. It grew over things regardless, and the things it grew over were not diminished by the growing. She thought about Wahlberg, wherever he had gone. She thought about Elsa Brandt in Missouri, and the Fisk couple in Oklahoma, and the German immigrant whose name had been Sievert, and who had taken $52 and walked out of the county records entirely. She thought about the 4 years she had spent drawing plat lines and running closure calculations in a back office in Abilene, learning the shape of a truth she had not known she would ever have a use for. She thought about Otto at his transit on a windy ridge, talking about land and what the land does not lie about, and about the people who falsify its description and the patience required to demonstrate the falsification in terms a county attorney could put before a judge. What is buried does not stay buried, not when the right person knows what to look for, and knowing what to look for is its own kind of inheritance, passed hand to hand across the years by the people who understood that the land does not lie. Only the papers describing it do, and that patience and a good instrument and the willingness to go through the clay are generally sufficient to reach what is real. She stayed at the site until the light began to go in the late afternoon. She watched the fan turn. She listened to the mechanism settle into its working rhythm, the pump rod rising and falling with a regularity that had not existed here for 11 years, and that would exist here, she intended, for a long time after. She walked back toward Hadley with the wrench in her hand and the rusted fan blade under her arm. If you have ever held a thing that someone trusted you to carry, you understand what that walk felt like. If you have ever opened your hand at an auction and found that what you were bidding on was larger than it appeared, leave a word about it below. There are more stories like this one. Stories of the quiet discoveries that changed everything. Stories of women who knew to go through the clay when everyone else had called the ground exhausted. The wrench went back into the valise that evening. Maren set it alongside the drafting instruments in their oilcloth wrap, and beside the ledger with its careful German script, and she latched the case and set it by the door for the morning. The rusted fan blade she leaned against the wall beside the door where it stayed. The well was there. The water was real. The land was hers. She had paid $6 for it, and it had given her back something that could not be measured by the acre, or assessed by a county official, or suppressed by a man with a pen and an arrangement. The knowledge that the surface deceives, and that she was the kind of person who knew to go through it.